It was a quiet evening in the small suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow over the neat rows of houses and a quaint little park at the corner of Maple Street. This was the kind of community where everyone knew each other, or thought they did. On this particular evening, the gentle hum of crickets filled the air as people went about their routines, blissfully unaware of the tension brewing just a few blocks away. At the corner store near the edge of town, Rachel Carter, a young black woman in her late 20s, stood at the counter paying for her groceries. She was a regular there, and Mr. Patel, the friendly shopkeeper, often greeted her with a smile and a quick chat about the weather or the latest town gossip. Tonight was no different, except for the unsettling presence lingering just outside the store. Rachel had noticed them when she walked in, a group of 3 men loitering by the entrance, their loud laughter and pointed stares impossible to ignore. They were dressed in warm leather jackets, their faces shadowed under the dim light of the flickering street lamp. Something about their demeanor made her uneasy, but she brushed it off, telling herself not to jump to conclusions. As Rachel stepped out of the store, the men's laughter died down. She could feel their eyes on her, heavy and unwelcoming. Her hands tightened around the grocery bags as she quickened her pace, heading toward her car parked just a few feet away. The sound of footsteps followed, deliberate and unhurried, sending a chill down her spine. "Hey there, sweetheart," one of the men called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "In a hurry, we just want to talk." Rachel ignored them, her heart pounding as she reached her car. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers trembling slightly. The men moved closer, their shadows looming over her. One of them stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "What's the rush?" he sneered, a smirk playing on his lips. "We're just being friendly." Rachel took a deep breath, summoning the courage to respond. "Please step aside," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "I don't want any trouble." But trouble was exactly what they were looking for. The tallest of the group, a man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned in closer. "Trouble? Nah, we're just having a little fun," he said, his tone laced with menace. Just then, a voice rang out from across the parking lot, a deep, commanding voice that cut through the tension like a knife. "Hey, what's going on over there?" The men froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the interruption. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking toward them with purposeful strides. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence exuding an air of quiet authority. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his cap, but his voice carried a weight that demanded attention. "Leave her alone," the stranger said, his tone calm but firm. The gang exchanged glances, their earlier bravado faltering. "Mind your own business, pal," the scarred man shot back, though his voice lacked the confidence it had moments ago. The stranger stopped a few feet away, his piercing gaze locking onto the group. "This is my business," he said simply. There was something about the way he spoke, calm yet unyielding, that made it clear he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Rachel watched the scene unfold, her fear giving way to a glimmer of hope. She didn't know who this man was or why he had intervened, but she was grateful nonetheless. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence stretching unbearably as the men weighed their options. Finally, the scarred man scoffed, gesturing for his companions to back off. "Let's go," he muttered, casting one last glare at the stranger. "This ain't worth it." As the gang retreated into the night, Rachel exhaled a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to thank the man who had come to her aid, but before she could speak, he raised a hand, cutting her off. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, filled with genuine concern. I think so," Rachel stammered, still processing what had just happened. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Just glad I was here," he said. "But you should be careful. People like that. They could always back down so easily." As he turned to walk away, Rachel called out after him. "Wait, who are you?" He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Just someone who doesn't like bullies," he replied before disappearing into the shadows. Rachel stood there for a moment, her groceries forgotten as she replayed the events in her mind. She didn't know who the stranger was, but one thing was certain. This encounter was far from over. The gang might have retreated tonight, but Rachel had a feeling this wasn't the last she'd see of them, and the thought left her both uneasy and determined. The faint sound of distant sirens echoed in the background as Rachel finally climbed into her car, her mind racing with questions. Little did she know the events of this night were only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would test her strength, her resilience, and a belief in the goodness of people. Rachel's hands were still trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound filling the car, but her mind was anything but quiet. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the men lurking behind her, watching her leave. But the parking lot was empty now, except for the distant glow of the corner store's lights. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since the encounter, and she could still hear the stranger's voice echoing in her ears. Just someone who doesn't like bullies. Who was he, and why did he step in the way he did? Rachel hadn't seen him before, but there was something about him that felt oddly familiar. Or maybe it was just the way he carried himself, like someone who'd been in situations like that before. As she drove through the quiet streets of Willowbrook, Rachel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling sitting heavily in her chest. This wasn't the first time she had felt out of place, but it was the first time things had escalated like that. The neighborhood was supposed to be safe. Sure, she had gotten a few cold stares here and there since moving in last year, but nothing had ever gone beyond that. Willowbrook was one of those small towns where people kept to themselves, and Rachel was happy to do the same. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the streetlights were flickering to life, casting long shadows over the front lawn. Rachel sat in the car for a moment longer, staring out the windshield. The soft glow from her living room window was comforting, a small reminder that she was home. But even as she stepped out and made her way inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The next morning, Rachel woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains, but the weight in her chest from the night before hadn't fully disappeared. She tried to go about her day as usual, replying to emails, making a cup of tea. But the encounter lingered at the back of her mind like a fog she couldn't clear. It wasn't until she went for her afternoon walk that she realized just how much the incident had unsettled her. As she passed by the park, she caught sight of someone sitting on one of the benches near the fountain. It was him, the stranger from last night. Rachel hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach him or keep walking. But something in her gut told her she needed to say thank you properly this time. She took a breath and crossed the grass toward the bench. The man looked up as she approached, his expression calm but guarded. Now that she could see him clearly in the daylight, Rachel noticed the faint lines on his face, like someone who had seen more than their fair share of difficult situations. "Hey," she said softly, offering a small smile. "I didn't get a chance to thank you properly last night." The man nodded, his eyes studying her for a brief moment before he responded. "No need to thank me. I just did what anyone should." Rachel shifted awkwardly, unsure of what to say next. "Still, I really appreciate it. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." The man's gaze softened slightly, and he gave a small nod. "I'm glad I was," he said simply. There was a pause between them, the kind that felt heavy but not uncomfortable. Rachel felt like she should ask more, who he was, why he stepped in, but something held her back. Instead, she sat down on the bench next to him, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I don't mean to pry," Rachel started carefully, "but you seem to show up at just the right time. Do you live around here?" The man let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "No, I'm just passing through," he replied. "But I've been around long enough to notice things." Rachel glanced at him curiously. "Notice what?" He hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. "Let's just say I've seen how some folks treat people they don't think belong." His words hung in the air, heavier than Rachel expected. She didn't push for more details, but she understood exactly what he meant. "I guess I felt that too," Rachel admitted quietly. "I moved here about a year ago. Thought it'd be peaceful." The man nodded knowingly. "Most of the time it is, but every town's got its shadows." They sat in silence for a while, watching the breeze ripple across the water in the fountain. Despite everything, Rachel felt oddly at ease sitting there. Before she could say anything else, the man stood up, brushing the dust off his jeans. "I should get going," he said, "but if you ever feel like someone's watching, trust your gut, and don't hesitate to speak up." Rachel looked up at him, frowning slightly. "You think they'll come back?" The man didn't answer right away, but his expression told her everything she needed to know. "Just be careful," he said at last. Rachel watched as he walked away, disappearing down the path lined with oak trees. She sat there for a long time after he was gone, turning his words over in her mind. The feeling of safety she once had in Willowbrook felt a little more fragile now, and while she wanted to believe the worst was over, Rachel had a sinking feeling that it was far from it. The days that followed were quiet, but Rachel couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over her life. Every time she stepped outside, it felt like the air carried a different weight, like the town itself had shifted ever so slightly. The familiar streets she once strolled without a second thought now seemed to watch her in return. Faces she passed felt colder, eyes lingering just a second too long. It wasn't obvious, not something anyone else might notice, but Rachel did. She told herself she was being paranoid. Maybe the encounter that night had put her on edge, making her read into things that weren't really there. But even as she tried to push those thoughts aside, little things kept happening. A week later, as Rachel left the local cafe with a coffee in hand, she saw them again, the three men from that night. They stood by a cluster of motorcycles parked near the gas station across the street. Their laughter was low, but carried just enough for Rachel to hear. One of them noticed her, elbowing the scarred man in the ribs before tilting his head in her direction. Rachel felt her pulse quicken as their eyes met, but she didn't stop walking. She kept her head high and her steps steady, even though every part of her screamed to hurry. As she passed, the scarred man muttered something to his friends, and though Rachel didn't catch all of it, she heard enough to understand the tone. She slipped into her car, locking the doors the second she sat down. Through the windshield, she saw them watching, their attention fixed on her until she pulled out of the parking lot and drove away. Rachel spent the rest of the day feeling restless. She busied herself around the house, cleaning, organizing, anything to keep her mind occupied. But by the time evening rolled around, she knew avoiding it wasn't going to make the feeling disappear. Later that night, as Rachel sat on her couch with a book open but unread, she glanced at her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen, debating whether she should call someone, maybe the police or even the stranger from that night. But what would she say? That group of men stood near a gas station and made her uncomfortable. She sighed, pacing the phone down. No laws had been broken. Not yet, anyway. The following morning, Rachel woke to find something strange on her front porch. A small envelope tucked carefully against the doorframe. She hadn't heard anyone approach, and for a moment, she simply stared at it through the peephole. Finally, curiosity and unease won out. Rachel opened the door slowly, scanning the empty street before crouching to pick it up. There was no name, no return address, just her first name written in smudged ink across the front. Her fingers felt cold as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It was her. Rachel recognized the image immediately. It had been taken just the day before outside the cafe. In the picture, she was walking to her car holding her coffee, with the three men standing in the distance. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the street, hidden somewhere out of sight. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, Rachel couldn't move. The photo slipped from her hands, fluttering to the ground as she stepped back inside and locked the door behind her. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she leaned against the door, the world outside suddenly feeling a lot closer than it had just moments ago. Rachel didn't know what the men wanted or why they were doing this, but one thing was clear: they weren't going away quietly. Rachel couldn't stop staring at the photo lying on the floor. It felt heavier than it should, as if the simple piece of paper carried more weight than the walls around her. She picked it up with trembling fingers, scanning the street outside through the curtains. Everything looked normal. The quiet neighborhood, the faint hum of distant traffic. But the photo said otherwise. Someone had been watching, and Rachel had no idea how long it had been happening. She paced the living room, phone clutched in her hand. She could call someone, but who? The police might take a report, but what could they really do? There was no proof of a crime, just an uneasy feeling and a photograph. Rachel doubted that was enough to make anyone take it seriously. Still, she couldn't ignore it. As much as she wanted to pretend this was just paranoia, she knew better. This was deliberate. Rachel forced herself to sit down, breathing deeply to steady her nerves. She thought about calling a friend, but most of them lived hours away, her family even further. The realization of how alone she was in this town hit harder than she expected. The stranger from the park crossed her mind again. His warning echoed faintly in her thoughts. Trust your gut. Rachel stood, grabbed her keys, and headed out. The air felt colder as she stepped outside, even though the sun still hung high in the sky. She scanned the street carefully before walking to her car. Every shadow, every parked vehicle felt like it held hidden eyes. She didn't have a plan, just a direction. Back to the park where she'd last seen him. Maybe it was a long shot, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he let on. The park was nearly empty when she arrived. Rachel wandered the paths, keeping her eyes open for any sign of the man. She was starting to think she'd imagined him entirely when a familiar voice broke the silence. Looking for someone. Rachel spun around, and there he was, standing near the fountain where they'd first talked. He had the same calm expression, but this time there was something else. Concern. Rachel approached cautiously, holding up the photograph. "This was on my porch this morning," she said quietly. He took the photo, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. He didn't say anything right away, but his jaw tightened, and Rachel knew he recognized what it meant. "How long have they been following you?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know. I never noticed anything before." Before that night, Rachel admitted, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from the weight of it. "I thought maybe it was over, but now this." The man nodded slowly, folding the photo carefully before slipping it into his jacket pocket. "They won't stop," he said, almost to himself. Rachel felt her stomach twist. "Why? I haven't done anything to them." "It's not about what you did," he replied, his gaze meeting hers. "Some people don't need a reason." Rachel swallowed hard, trying to keep her fear in check. "What am I supposed to do?" He glanced around the park as if making sure they were alone. "You need to be careful. They're testing you, seeing how much they can get away with before you push back." Rachel frowned, frustration bubbling beneath her fear. "I shouldn't have to live like this," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "You're right," the man agreed. "But until they're dealt with, you have to stay ahead of them." Rachel studied him for a long moment. There was something about him that felt steady, like he'd been through worse and came out the other side. "Who are you?" she asked finally. He hesitated, then offered a faint smile. "Just someone who's been in your shoes before." Rachel wanted to ask more, but the weight of everything felt too heavy. She nodded, deciding to let it go for now. As they walked back toward the parking lot, Rachel felt the tension ease just slightly. But even as the stranger offered quiet reassurances, she knew the worst hadn't passed yet. Somewhere out there, the men were still watching, still waiting, and Rachel wasn't sure how much time she had before they decided to make their next move. Rachel barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every distant noise outside, kept her wide awake, staring at the ceiling. She left the lights on in the living room, unsure if it made her feel safer or just more exposed. Morning came slowly, and Rachel dragged herself through her routine. She tried to focus on work, but the constant weight of someone watching gnawed at the back of her mind. She kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see one of them standing across the street, just out of reach. But the day passed without incident. By evening, Rachel started to think maybe she was overreacting. Maybe the stranger at the park was right. This was just intimidation. She could ignore it, live her life, and eventually they'd get bored. Then her phone rang. Rachel almost didn't answer when she saw the number was blocked, but something about the silence in her house made her pick up. She didn't speak first. For a few seconds, there was nothing but faint breathing on the other end. "Rachel." The voice was calm, but she recognized it immediately, the scarred man. Her grip tightened around the phone. "How did you get this number?" "I've always had it," he replied casually, as if they were old friends catching up. "Just thought it was time to say hello properly." Rachel forced herself to stay calm. "What do you want?" "You don't seem to understand what's happening," he said, his tone still unnervingly calm. "This isn't over because you walked away that night. You embarrassed us." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. "I didn't do anything." "You didn't have to," he replied. "But now I need to make sure you remember us. I don't like being forgotten." Rachel swallowed hard, trying to think of something, anything to say. But the line clicked dead before she could respond. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down. She stared at it for a long time, half expecting him to call back. He didn't, but the damage was already done. Rachel locked every door and window, pacing the house as the sun dipped below the horizon. She thought about calling the police, but what could she say? A blocked call and a vague threat weren't exactly solid evidence. The stranger's warning echoed in her mind. They won't stop. Rachel's phone buzzed again, but this time it was a text. "Check your back porch." Her breath caught. She didn't want to look, but something in her told her she had to. Slowly, Rachel crept to the back door and flicked on the porch light. There was nothing there at first. Then she noticed it right near the steps. A single black leather glove, laid carefully as if someone had placed it there on purpose. Rachel didn't touch it. She backed away, locking the door again and pulling the curtains shut. She paced for what felt like hours before finally sitting down, her knees pulled to her chest. Her phone sat on the table, the screen dark. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, her phone buzzed one more time. Another message. "You left the light on." Rachel froze. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Slowly, she turned her head toward the living room window. Through the narrow gap in the curtains, she could see it. The faint glow of the lamp she'd forgotten to switch off. Someone was watching, right now. Rachel stayed perfectly still, waiting for another message, another sign. But nothing else came. By the time the sun rose, Rachel hadn't slept at all. But as the light flooded the room, she realized something. She wasn't going to wait for them to make the next move. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she never thought she'd use. The stranger from the park answered after just 2 rings. "I need your help," Rachel said quietly. There was no hesitation in his response. "I'm already on my way." Rachel sat by the window, watching the street with a silent determination she hadn't felt before. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on her, but fear had slowly turned into something else: resolve. She wasn't going to live like this, not anymore. By the time the knock came at her door, Rachel was already unlocking it. The stranger from the park stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting trouble to leap from the shadows. He didn't say much, just nodded when she gestured to the couch. Rachel paced, unable to sit. "They left this on my porch," she said, pointing to the glove resting on the table. He walked over, studying it carefully. "It's a message," he said quietly. "They want you to know they can get close whenever they want." Rachel crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "I can't keep waiting for them to make the next move. What do I do?" He looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring her words. "There's something you need to understand. People like this, they thrive on fear. The more you hide, the worse it gets. But if you confront them, if you show them you're not afraid, they back down." Rachel frowned. "And if they don't?" His eyes darkened. "Then we make sure they regret it." There was no bravado in his tone, just quiet certainty. Rachel felt her heart steady. She wasn't alone in this. Later that night, Rachel left her living room light on, intentionally this time. She sat by the window, the glove placed in clear view on the porch. It felt risky, but the stranger assured her it was necessary. Hours passed, and Rachel began to think maybe the message had worked. But just as she was about to head to bed, she caught movement near the edge of the street. A figure stepped out of the shadows, heading toward her house. Rachel's heart raced, but she stayed put, watching as the man approached the porch. The scarred man. His eyes locked onto the glove, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. Then he crashed down, reaching for it. Before his fingers could touch the leather, the porch light flickered. Rachel glanced at the stranger beside her, who gave a small nod. The front door swung open. Rachel stepped outside, standing taller than she felt. The scarred man straightened, his smirk faltering as his eyes met hers. "Something wrong?" Rachel asked, her voice steady. He tilted his head, his grin returning. "Just wanted to check in. Make sure you're comfortable." Rachel didn't flinch. "I am. But if you keep showing up, I might have to call someone to escort you out next time." His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Rachel thought he might push back. But then his gaze drifted to the man standing silently behind her, watching with an expression Rachel couldn't quite read. The scarred man's smirk faded completely. Without another word, he turned and walked back down the steps, disappearing into the night. Rachel exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave her body. She closed the door behind her, locking it with a sense of finality she hadn't felt before. The stranger lingered by the window, keeping watch until the sun started to rise. As he prepared to leave, Rachel finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind. "Why are you helping me?" He paused by the door, glancing back with a faint smile. "Someone helped me once. I'm just passing it on." Rachel watched him disappear down the street, knowing she might not see him again. But for the first time in days, the house felt lighter. The fear wasn't completely gone, but it no longer controlled her. She picked up the glove from the table and tossed it into the trash.